Not only are we very lucky to have two leading journalists in the China watching and US watching space, but they're also leading, I think, voices online and kind of in this space about the ways in which journalism is coming under fire in the US-China relationship. And on behalf of myself and the whole National Committee and YCP team, we're so excited to be able to speak to you guys and go behind the byline and to hear a little bit more from the kind of personal side of what exactly it's been like for the past few months reporting as a Chinese journalist reporting in the US and vice versa. Amy is the China correspondent for the New York Times, and Olivia Zhang is the chief correspondent for Caixin Media here based in DC. I just wanted to kind of first turn the floor over to the two of you to talk a little bit about what exactly brought you to the field of journalism, how you got here, and I guess what your current role looks like. So Amy, can I turn to you first?
Sure. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today, and thanks for allowing me to share some thoughts on this topic. I definitely am one of those people who fell into journalism. I think I was interested in China first. My family is all from China. Most of my family is still in China. And I grew up in California in the Bay Area and sort of spent summers going back when I was a kid to Caixin, where my dad's family is from, and going into the village. And I think that it was just this crazy contrast to go from like suburban California to like village life, early 90s China. I still have nightmares about the outhouse. But, you know, I just, from there on, I think it was a lot, like a lot of ABCs, I just had this sort of interest in my, you know, learning more about family history and background. And so that's how I sort of had this interest in China over the years. And when I went to college, I also studied Chinese politics. I was lucky that I went to UC Berkeley, and there were some amazing professors on the faculty there who focused on China. And I got to spend a lot of time with all of them. And I continued that into my master's. And in the summer between my 2 years at Oxford, I did a summer at Baidu, and many of you are probably familiar with Kaiser Kuo, and I did an internship with him. And I mean, I thought I was going to, you know, unmask Chinese censorship. It definitely was not the case there, but it did introduce me to journalism, and through Kaiser, I did meet a lot of people. And so, you know, I spent a lot of nights in Beijing just hanging around the journalism crowd, and I just sort of fell into it. I met Ed Wong, who is now a DC correspondent, and you know, he sort of just pulled me in, and I started working for the New York Times and the Beijing bureau, and I guess the rest is history. So I just sort of started writing from there, and, you know, started out doing some small kind of blog items, and now I have a kind of more general focus on China.
So thank you so much for inviting me and hear my side of stories. So I think I was kind of different. I wasn't that kind of person. Like, I knew I'm so into journalism, like when I was a kid. I wasn't like that. I think I didn't know, like, I have this passion in journalism until I was in graduate school, actually. I was studying at Communication University of China, and then I got this exchange student, like a program opportunity to study in Australia, where you can take 4 courses maximum, and I took all journalism related, say like broadcaster journalism, multimedia journalism, and a journalism internship. So I just felt like, okay, that's, you know, the nonfiction journalistic reporting is where my passion was. And I also really enjoyed living abroad to have like that unique perspective. And I decided that I wanted to live abroad longer than just the 4 months. So I applied schools, and I ended up go to the UK, even though that's not a journalism degree, but when I get back, I still I knew I wanted to do journalism. I ended up, like, you know, working for Caixin. It's my first full-time job. It's a really great opportunity. And I remember, like, before I got this job at Caixin, and I was, you know, when you do interviews and the people ask you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I would say, like, oh, I want to be an international correspondent. At that time, I think when I said that, I don't think that will become true anytime soon. But it just 2 times after 2 years after I worked for Caixin, and I was so fortunate enough, to be the U.S. correspondent for Caixin, and now it's 2.5 years past, and I'm really grateful for what my past experiences, and never regret any minute of it.
Great. Well, maybe we can fast forward a little bit. It's really interesting to hear how you both came into the field. Amy, maybe more through the China area focus lens, and Olivia through the correspondent journalism background. Either, both paths have led you to a place where you're now, practicing journalists, and under a very different set of circumstances than even a year ago you might have faced in your current role. So can you kind of walk us through, each of you, from February to May, kind of what's been going on for you? Amy, I know you were in Wuhan, and I think everyone now knows that the New York Times journalists were expelled from China right around that same time. So can you kind of walk us through what exactly that period looked like for you, and the impact of the policies from the Chinese government had upon you and your colleagues?
Yeah, and I basically went to Wuhan at the end of January, and I was there for a while and reporting on the ground there, and it was an incredible trip, and I had no idea then that it was going to be my last reporting trip in China. I evacuated with the State Department on their last flight out to San Diego in mid-February, and we went to the Miramar Air Base in San Diego. They actually didn't tell us where we were going until when we almost landed, so we thought we could possibly be going. We just knew we were going to the U.S. And at the time, I remember feeling so relieved because I was like, I'm safe in the U.S. It's so great here. But then also having a red flag, because they were like, you don't have to wear masks in your quarantine, you guys can hang out with each other. And 2 people had tested positive, and I was like, this seems a little weird. So I was there for 2 weeks doing the quarantine, and then I basically flew straight back to Beijing just to continue working. And basically, we've always all kind of known, and it's not the first time that journalists have been expelled from China. We saw in February that there were 3 Wall Street Journal journalists expelled. And so, we've all kind of known that it was possible, but I think, it was definitely still a shock. I remember it was in March, and the day before, I had found out in the middle of the night that Idris Elba had tested positive for the virus. And so I woke up my fiance, and I was like, oh my God, Idris Elba just tested positive. He was like, never wake me up for that again. And then the next day I also had woken up in the middle of the night. I was looking at my phone, and around 2 or 3 a.m. I started getting messages. I saw that I had a bunch of frantic messages from people, including some of my colleagues. And the order had just come out, basically saying that we had been expelled from China, and we had, only a few days to get out. And I was like, should I wake him up? And I was like, I think this counts, right? So I woke him up, and I was like, and he's like, what? So yeah, that was in mid-March, and since then it's just been sort of, what was already a very hectic year has just continued to be a very hectic year. I basically left within 10 days to go to the US. I mean, it was very stressful because, as we all know, this has been happening now for months now. It's just been so difficult to get flights to go places. I had at one point, I think, 3 tickets booked to Japan, Korea, and then to the US, which is where I ended up in LA for 2 weeks. And the whole time just continuing to report on what was happening in Wuhan and in China. And so I holed up in in LA for 2 weeks. And then I flew to Taiwan, which is where I am now. And I've been here now for about 3 months, and finally just getting settled in over the next few weeks, which is a good feeling because I've been living, many of us have been uprooted, I think, from our normal routines. So it's nice to get back into something here.
That is a hectic journey. I feel like that is the exact opposite of most of us who've been holed away in their homes for the past few months. So glad you made it safe, and that you're getting settled in there as well. And Olivia, how about for you? You've been in the US the whole time, so maybe a slightly different experience, but you've also been here covering, well, first the US government policies that have impacted your work, and then also covering Black Lives Matter and some other really big moments here in the US, and how How has that gone for you?
Yeah. So in contrast to image journal, I have been stay put in the US. But I remember actually in February, I was actually in Iowa and in New Hampshire covering the 2020 primaries. And I remember at that time, because the situation in China was really bad about coronavirus, and I remember asking state officials or people at at the ground and asking how do you think of coronavirus? It's like, what? It's like no one's ever. It just no one pay attention to that. And then came back when the situation in the U.S. was really starting to getting worse, and then the U.S. president having kind of a daily briefings and short notice briefings, because I live really close to the White House, so I can make it every time to the briefings. At that time, he wasn't so hostile to China, so I remember asking him China-related questions. He actually said, you know what, this coronavirus is gonna make U.S. and China closer, which we all know. And then after that I think then the White House started to have a social distancing policy that I wasn't part of the White House pro. So I don't have access anymore. So I just started covering, the White House briefings or state responses from my apartment. And then the Black Lives Matter, the protest that happens, and that's probably the only main events that I covered on the ground since March. So that was a really interesting experience as well. And also, I think it's also kind of trying to get the more nuances in covering the protest instead of just it's a pure confront between the protesters and the police. And I remember I read a story on how there's actually a civilized conversation between protesters and policemen, and they were kneeling. It's just a kind of a very dramatic or emotional moment. I wanted readers to know more nuances to that story instead of just the violent. So, and then ever since I started just doing interviews at home on the perspective of the 2020 elections or the US-China relations related stories. So yeah, talking about it, it feels like I have been going through a lot.
Yeah, a lot of not a lot of locations, but a lot of content.
Exactly. Yeah.
Staying on that for a minute, I guess my next question would be, you have quite a lot of responsibility and a big task in front of you trying to explain or kind of contextualize issues like Black Lives Matter for a Chinese audience back home. Many of whom, have very little maybe personal interaction with some of these issues. How do you approach that work? What do you prioritize? What do you focus on? Or kind of what are your tactics for explaining US culture, especially when it comes to complicated questions like race, to a Chinese audience?
Yeah, actually, because, Caixin is more like a business economic focused. So I was initially, when I first came here in the US, I covered mainly, the trade tensions and also the tech contest. But it just with everything going on, it's just so hard not to cover politics or culture anymore. So it is a really complicated issue. So I that kind of stories. It's not a hard news. It's my personal encounter, which I wrote in the form of a reporter's note, and I have video footage and have pictures to show the readers what it actually look like. So it is complex. So I just, I feel like people here are generally open to talk to reporters. I just went on the street to talk to protesters, and there are actually kind of a lead protester asking people to talk to reporters, encouraging people. So they want their story to be heard, and I listened to their story and I read about their story. So it helps me a lot to understand these issues as well. And I don't think I fully, understand the issues yet, but it's just by listening talking to them and also talking to experts, professors, I definitely helped my personal understanding to this. And I just that hopefully will help our readers back in China understand this as well.
And do you have a sense of whether or not, like, how are your Chinese readers reading these pieces? What do they, have a sense of what they're thinking about?
I heard from my editor, he told me like that piece about the conversation between the protester and the police actually got a lot of positive feedback. But it's hard to say. I think it could be a whole nother conversation on this issue, but I definitely think the readers who actually read Caixin, they are more open. They're, for this kind of details and nuances behind the stories, but it could be another different group who just don't think that's something they would like to listen. It's, it's like here, you have people have different views, so it's really hard to say how they actually, one view on a certain thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Amy, turning to you, it must be a very different perspective hearing from people on the street kind of dying to talk to a reporter and give their comment, because I know that you've spoken a lot about how difficult it's been to do reporting in China, especially getting the kind of the voices of actual people rather than undisclosed contacts. So do you want to kind of fill in a little bit about how you share information about China to a Western audience and what you prioritize?
Yeah, I think that I'm grateful to the Times for giving us more space to go out there and try to find voices on the ground. And, I think my last two trips are a huge contrast. I took a trip in December to Xinjiang. I went to Hotan, and I didn't even try to speak to anyone while I was on the ground there, because I just knew that, as soon as we would get out of a taxi, people would jump into the taxi and try to talk to the driver, even though he obviously had knew nothing. So, being aware of that, we didn't try to talk to anyone. We were mostly just there to try to get some sense of color and texture of the place. And I think that it really illustrates how difficult in some ways reporting in China has become on the ground. But I mentioned earlier that going to Wuhan was actually an amazing experience, and it was, and not only because it was crazy to see what was happening there on the ground early on in this whole pandemic, but also because people there were so actually willing to talk and really, really, really open. Even, we kind of I've talked about before about how in China, especially when you're foreign media approaching someone, you don't advertise. You're like, I'm the New York Times. If you call someone usually in the US and you'd say the New York Times, they'll call you back pretty quickly. But in China, it's sort of like, I'm a reporter, I work for an American newspaper, and they start digging, and then inevitably they sort of turn away. But in Wuhan, it was not the case at all. They didn't carry that. We were from the New York Times. They were so desperate. So many of the people who we met who were at hospitals were just so desperate to tell their story and get their voice out there that actually they were very open to talking. But, over the last few months, I've had an opportunity to try to do stories on China about what's happening in China from outside of China. It's definitely difficult, but actually easier than I would have expected. I think, of course, there is still a lot of skepticism about foreign media, but as long as you're not talking about, extremely sensitive topics, I think people are still, willing to share their thoughts. And I've been pleasantly surprised about how that's gone. It makes me more optimistic about doing reporting on China from outside of China.
Well, good. Optimism is definitely something positive to be promoted. So I guess shifting to the readership, how do you try to make sense of China for a Western audience or an American audience particularly? China is now on the front page almost every day, not always for positive reasons from the US side or the Chinese side. So, I think as more Americans have become, I guess, more familiar with some of the key things that are happening in China, and especially in the US-China relationship, how has that changed the way that you do your job?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot, what role we can play in this broader environment. And I think that, you know, as I sort of described earlier, I got into China journalism because I did want to help bridge, you know, understanding between these two cultures that I grew up with and I'm very familiar with. And I think that is a big responsibility for any, you know, non-Chinese newspaper to communicate back to their audiences back home, you know, what's going on in China. And I always sort of think about like people who come to visit us in China, and the impression that they get from just visiting China is so different from what they read about in the papers. And I think that that's oftentimes our responsibility to try our best to sort of present this whole picture of not just what's happening politically, but also what's happening, you know, culturally and socially. And it's just such a dynamic place. You know, any of us who've been there know that it's extremely different. And, you know, so on one hand, I think that that's an extremely important responsibility. But on the other hand, recognizing over the years that as Chinese media and local media have become more constrained in what they're able to do, you know, we've seen so many journalists at, you know, like Olivia's publication at Caixin and other great Chinese news outlets sort of jump ship and go on to, you know, doing PR jobs and stuff, which is understandable because of the climate there. And, you know, we had this brief kind of window where we saw how incredible these journalists are. I mean, you know, Caixin did incredible reporting during the coronavirus, what was happening in Wuhan and what was happening across the country. And I think that one of the editors at the publication said that they only published a fraction of what they got, which I think shows you how, you know, how much we're missing basically by not being able to publish, you know, have this very robust force. So I think the sort of second role that is kind of coming more into play now is also trying to, you know, journalism is to hold power to account. And I think that that's also a role that we take very seriously. So in addition to trying to present this very kind of full picture of what's happening in China to our audiences, we do, you know, have to feel like I think there is a sort of responsibility to, do these sort of more stories that kind of question what's happening there in terms of the power dynamics and what the leadership is doing there. And I think it's a constant sort of difficulty to kind of balance between the two. And lately, you know, especially not being on the ground now, I think the first sort of priority that I was talking about in terms of representing like the culture is just so much more difficult now because we can't be there and be talking to people.
Staying on that topic for a minute, I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience have read recent news about the New York Times pulling a lot of stuff from their Hong Kong office and moving to Seoul. I think that there'll be a lot of questions about that. I don't know how much you can say, but I guess just what are your reflections on that news, and also, I guess, just the way in which journalism in China is kind of increasingly moving to the periphery?
Yeah, I mean, you know, our expulsion order, I think, like I said earlier, we were always sort of expecting something like that, not expecting something like that to happen, but it wasn't a total surprise. I do think that the fact that the order also covered Hong Kong was a surprise for us. And, you know, right now, I still don't even know what the status is and if we'd be able to go in there. But to be honest, I didn't know about the move until I read the New York Times article, like many of you, that we were going to Seoul. But I wouldn't at all see it as a retreat. I mean, you know, when you read a story, you see our byline, but behind our byline actually is a bunch of really, really talented and smart editors and people working, you know, behind the scenes who are helping us put stuff online. Like, I wish I could say that I wrote, you know, perfect Sterling copy and that's exactly what went online, but actually there's a lot of people who are helping us behind the scenes. So, you know, just in terms of like business operations, I think it sort of makes sense. Like if there are going to be visa issues for people, then, you know, it's just sort of makes sense to kind of go into an environment that has more certainty. And clearly, like, things in Hong Kong are changing and are uncertain right now. So we're not at all, you know, it's not a retreat. We're not pulling any reporters. If anything, I think we're sort of doubling down on the story there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know. I wasn't involved in like the top level decisions on this, but that's, I think, you know, what's happening there.
I wish they had consulted you. I'm sorry about it. But no, that makes sense. And I guess just any thoughts that you might have related to that on the national security law and how that's going to continue to impact the reporting there from your perch at the New York Times?
Yeah, they obviously, the national security law mentions specifically strengthening management of media organizations there. And I think that like a lot of other sectors in Hong Kong right now, everyone is asking what this law means for them. And until there is more guidance, I think that probably the default, as it's been in a lot of sectors, is to sort of just wait and see. And so, I don't really know. I think probably that's clearly the way in which they rolled out this law. It was intended to intimidate and to sort of to be a show of force. And so I think that that's what we're seeing now. Is I don't know, when or if we'll see more guidance. I think that, just from recently, I did a story about how it's affecting the education sector in Hong Kong. I think a lot of people are hoping that eventually it'll be sort of dialed back and won't be sort of as looming as it is now over like large parts of the population. So I think that's, my guess is probably it's the same for media operating there too.
Yeah. And shifting back to you, Olivia, I mean, you've also had the challenge of reporting on US policies that are coming out that are quite harsh towards Chinese nationals in the US, Chinese students. The recent report, I think, was from last night that the Fulbright program is also going to potentially be suspended for Hong Kong and China. And a lot of these kind of bonds of, connection between the US and China are eroding. And I know a lot of your readers, I'm sure, like, people who have benefited from these connections, folks who have traveled to the US or gone to school in the US. How do you report these things out, and how do you make sense of these from the perspective of a Chinese, reporter based in the US?
Yeah, I think an interesting thing is that you start to read stories that actually influence yourself. So for the visa policy, the US retaliated towards the Chinese government's actions and make any reporter of Chinese national, no matter who you work for, a state media, non-state media, or Western media, as long as you're holding I visa, you have to apply for extension every 90 days. And I mean, from what I've seen is they are not trying to, they're not trying to expel journalists. It's just that they are having this 90-day duration of stay and require you to apply. So it seems to me that as long as you apply within the 90 days window, and you will be able to get extension, but no one had, it's really new, and we haven't, no one has gone through the first run yet. So that's one thing. And another is like what I mentioned is because I was actually mainly focused on economic and the business side of US-China relations, but now I just found myself writing so much more like non-business related, like, the visa, international student visas, journalist visa and other stuff. So it just, what I have been trying to do, and I think that is my, responsibility, is just to present, our readers in China, what's really happening in the US regarding the US-China relations. I definitely not have, present my personal opinion in my pieces. I may have my own opinion, but I try not to present in my pieces, and just offer balanced stories, from both sides. So it has been kind of hard to, you just have to, detach yourself to those, it's all personal stories, and you talk to those international students and how they're feeling and how certainty they're feeling. It just felt like, the past few days or few weeks, there's something new coming out, like targeting at you, like all my friends, or, it's just so much uncertainty. It's definitely not I know Amy said he felt optimistic reporting outside China. I kind of felt pessimistic reporting in the US right now. So yeah.
That's, can you just unpack that a little bit? What, you just feel like the policies are not going to get better, or do you feel like the environment for journalists itself is getting more constrained?
Yeah, I think for the U.S.-China relations, I think a lot of people could agree on this. Is you would see more tensions. Not I think when I first came here, it seems like mainly on trade stuff, and then expanded in tech, and then it's just seems like almost every front. So there's stories coming out about what Trump administration is planning to do, the visa ban on the party members, and a lot of it's just that yeah, personally I don't think we're gonna see things getting better, especially with with this pandemic and the election season coming up. So it just being tough on China is gonna be the main thing for this, in terms of foreign policy. And for journalists in the U.S. of Chinese national, like what you mentioned to us before, the Chinese storyteller. This policy just not influence Chinese state media or Chinese media in general, but also influence other media outlets. Like they're all brilliant Chinese students. They came to the U.S. for journalism school, and they want to get a job to be a journalist in the U.S. media or other media outlet. But then they have to apply for extension every 90 days. How does that going to influence their, employers? Definitely it's going to be something employer would take into consideration when trying to hire them. So it's just I hate to be pessimistic, but I just don't see anything that's for me to be positive about.
For those of you who don't know, Chinese Storytellers is a really phenomenal collective of mostly US-trained ethnically Chinese journalists who are a really phenomenal group of people reporting on not only the actual content of the news between these two countries, but the kind of the personal narrative of how identity and politics and journalism all kind of come into conflict. So I encourage everyone to subscribe to their newsletter if you haven't, because it's definitely worth your time to read. And just one more question on that, Olivia, which is, you work for Caixin, which is non-state media and has a reputation within China as being a very strong voice for kind of a progressive voice within the media space. And I think less well known in the US. How do you feel like you're perceived as a Chinese journalist in the American context, and how does that change kind of the stories you cover or the ways in which you do your job?
Yeah, so actually I remember like I did an interview with New York Times magazine. Actually, they're doing like a feature on foreign correspondent, and this is like how I summarize my situation in the US is it's always difficult to be a foreign correspondent and because of in terms of access, but me being a Chinese journalist just add another layer of difficulty to that. I have been come across like various incidents that whenever the people I was talking to know like I'm working for a Chinese media, they just think like you work for state media or you are not a real journalist. And I remember I was at a private event, like talking to a junior staff of a U.S. politicians, lawmakers. And because back then I was really trying hard to reach out to politicians, even anti-China, China hawk, trying to get a better sense of what they are thinking, understand to better report. But I never heard back from them, and I would attach like a 3 months complimentary code for Caixin Global English version and say, oh, if you can see like what we are covering and we are blah blah blah, like introduction. But like also there's something like I may go to public events to that I may get a chance to ask the questions, And then I probably would write that story, include the quote, and send to the PR, press office, and say, okay, I really would like to follow on that topic. If this is the story, this is the Chinese story, this is the English version of story, but I never heard back. So at that event, it's like a personal conversation. I asked him like why I never heard back, and he said like because you are Chinese media, no one trusts Chinese media. And I was saying, but we are like, I'm not working for state media, we are private media. And he said Huawei is a private company, no one buys it. I don't know what to say. So it just the incidents like that happens a lot. It's just I just really think I try really hard to try to get the other side of the story, but I wasn't that luck. So what I have been trying to do just attend those public events or press conferences, like which is a public where I may get a chance to ask you questions. So I think that has worked well. And also another thing is I think it's in February or something I was at, I think I also mentioned that in Chinese Storyteller newsletter, that was like the HHS Secretary Azar's press conference in February. I asked him like, I think I asked him like when would the U.S. consider loosen the travel restrictions on China, and also why are you still calling COVID-19 Chinese virus? And then I don't know, someone just posted that part of that video on Twitter, and everyone's saying like, oh, she's just a propagandist or something. You have come across this kind of situation in private settings, and I kind of just accept it. I don't take it personally, but when I took on Twitter and so many people are tweeting and trolling, it's another different thing to process. So I eventually come to terms with it, but also what I was really glad to know, I don't know, a couple of weeks later, is that a congresswoman saw that video, and she later also asked the Secretary Azar, mentioned my question to him, and asking him like, will he be willing to stop calling COVID-19 Chinese virus? And he said, oh, yes, that's like, he took the question I asked too hard, and that wasn't intended or something. So he stopped calling the coronavirus Chinese virus. So I just feel like, okay, that's worth the trolling I got to kind of make a contribution to, Asians or Asian Americans community in the US. But I maybe not help that much, but that's my tiny bit of contribution to that. So I think Amy definitely faces a lot of other challenges reporting in China, but this is probably another different types of difficulty to report in the US because, this kind of ideological differences but yeah, I think it's not just me and, other Chinese national reporters, they're all trying their best to cover every member of Chinese Storyteller. Sorry, I keep advocating for Chinese Storyteller, but it's just that I feel so proud of their job and they're doing so good. So it just, I just have like always look up to them and they're so courage and to do everything they are doing. So yeah, it just maybe that's probably could be part of like optimism that come from. Yeah,
that's definitely a more positive note, because I think that I very much understand that feeling of I guess it sounds like almost like stereotyping based on like the name of your organization, that there's a specific agenda that the Chinese media must be portraying, and Chinese storytellers, again, and I think in Amy and me, all the journalists who are out there are this huge advocate for this evidence that like I think of this moment in journalism that I think has been the case for much of the previous decade or longer, that you can be from anywhere and you can report good stories and you can move back and forth between two places and you can train in the US and work for BBC and live in whatever in Finland. But like, I think what is concerning to a lot of folks is seeing just those windows and seemingly closing, and that the just the opportunities for diverse views on topics in US-China relations specifically are getting fewer. So I mean, I think it's a testament to both of you too, that you're able to be, continue to do your job and to do it to such a high degree. But I think it's also, I know that there are a lot of folks who signed up for this event who are journalism students, and I'd be really curious what you would both recommend to that generation of kind of newly trained people entering the field. I think that there's a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, and a lot of really good stories to be told. But I think, realistically, I think folks are feeling a little bit pessimistic about entering the journalism space at this moment in time, especially if they're a Chinese journalist studying in the US or a US, budding journalist trying to study in China. So I'd be curious what you guys would say to the next generation of journalists who are thinking about reporting in this space. And maybe I can start with you, Amy.
That's a good question. I think that, all of the normal journalism advice, just write, get a lot of practice writing, keep on pitching, be persistent. I definitely think if you're interested in doing China journalism, writing about China in English, I think that the language is more than ever important. It just makes such a difference to be able to have a conversation in China and to hear the nuances and it's such an interesting, complicated language, and to be able to have like hold a full conversation with people. And also just because, people are sort of not as open to talking to the media. And so to be able to have kind of snatches of conversation or be able to very fluently kind of approach someone, I think that makes all the difference. And so I would definitely say that I've heard from correspondents now who don't have the Chinese language skills. And so working in the field now is just much more difficult than I think it was 10, 20 years ago. Not to say that you can't at all. I mean, there's incredible journalists that don't speak the language well who still do a really great job, but I just think it makes it that much easier.
And Olivia, what would you suggest?
Yeah, language is definitely, I think, is very important for you to be able to have like a really real conversation with, no matter where you report from. And also I think probably for Chinese nationals starting journalism, it's definitely not a good time. But I mean, I still think just it is because so much is happening between US China right now, and there is that eagerness for what is really happening. There is that information hunger there, that space for journalists to feel. So even maybe the space is not as wide as it was before, but I mean, if you're really passionate about it and you're, I feel like there will be a time maybe, and there's still space you can do something. And it's just to think I don't think it should be less people doing journalism in US and China, but the opposite. So I'm probably not sure about like, maybe because of those like visa issues or something, maybe made it difficult, but so I may not have like a practical way how you can do that, but just think that demand is definitely there. And I do think like, Chinese nationals doing China related reporting outside of China, they can bring a unique perspective to the newsroom that maybe a lot of, other reporters may didn't, ignore or, didn't realize. So I just think that there is that need, and there will be, it's just to continue doing what they are doing.
Great. And staying on that topic of identity, especially, the Chinese identity as being an important way to like look at the stories in a different light and vice versa. I'm going to turn to one of the questions that came in through the Q&A chat. And this is a good PSA for anyone who's listening and has a question to ask. You can put those in, if you hit the Q&A button, you can add those in, and we'll turn to Q&A now so we can get to those. But there was an anonymous question that came in here for Amy, talking about your ABC identity and how you reconcile your identity with the disintegration of US-China relations during this pandemic, and how you kind of balance those two sides.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that in terms of, like a lot of people who have sort of mixed identities, I think your identity comes out in some situations more than others. So, spending time in China, I definitely feel my American identity more. As soon as I step back into the US, I immediately am aware of the fact that I look Chinese and I am Chinese. And I think that I've thought about this a lot. And sometimes I think about how, the reporting that we do is really important and holds power to account. But I also think about the impact of that in the US. I do get nervous when my mom, at least in like the earlier months, was going out with a mask and to Costco, and I just don't want her to be discriminated against. I feel conflicted about that. And I think where I've landed on that is we should be continuing to do, and what we are is investing in reporting on China the way that we see it. But also I think that it's incumbent upon, US media organizations or to report on communities in the US also in a more fully realized way. I know that we have seen a lot of reports recently about, attacks and discrimination against Asian Americans in the US during this pandemic, and that's so disheartening to see. And I think it's important to report on that, but also when it's not during the pandemic, we should be reporting on these communities anyway from other perspectives too. I just think about, in January, I was home for Chinese New Year right before I went to Wuhan, and people were already social distancing then. And if we had been covering, these communities and paying attention to what was happening among like the Chinese immigrant population in the US, like we would have known that. I knew this because I knew I was probably going to Wuhan, that hand sanitizer was sold out in January, that masks were getting sold out, that people were social distancing. Like this was happening months before anything was happening, this sort of rose to our consciousness. So that's what I think I would hope to see is just sort of more coverage of these sorts of communities in the US to kind of balance out what I guess people see as negative coverage that's happening on this side of the world.
Great, really, really interesting. And how about you, Olivia? Do you feel like, maybe asking the question slightly differently, but I guess after living in the US for a number of years, what do you hope that Chinese audiences would understand about the US that they might not get from their kind of regular media diet?
I think it's kind of similar. Is like, we all talk about, when the US-China relation is getting worse, the people-to-people communicational exchange is really important. So I just think like, there's increasing nationalism on both sides, especially if you see on both the social media on Twitter or Weibo. So I just, I want, it's like not just when they say like American people, they're not like representing the government. They're just the human beings and trying, is like everyone else. And especially like during this pandemic, it's the situation, if the situation in the US is not getting better, the world is not going back to normal. It's like, we are living in such an interconnected world. So it's not there may be policies coming from both governments that are hostile, but the people to people side shouldn't be hostile. And I think there's one thing, the US government, I think you've heard talking points about how they distinguish Chinese government to Chinese people, but I think what US government is doing is they didn't reflect what they're talking about, because what the policies they are having, what they're hurting is Chinese people, Chinese students, Chinese scholars, or Chinese tourists, or it doesn't reflect in their actions. So it's just I think it's on both sides, like it's just should be so much more nuances in it, and shouldn't be just that cookie cutter approach on both sides.
Building off of that, there's a question from Bridget Donovan, who's on staff at the National Committee, which I think gets to some of those other sides of those questions. So I'm curious to ask and hear what you guys think. When she asks, when you submit your draft copy to editors, do you get the sense that the published article, the tone or nuance has been changed consistently in any particular way, harsher, more hyperbolic, or softer tone even. And I guess in the context of what, maybe framing that a little bit of like, kind of what do you think readers are looking for, or do you write for what readers are looking for? Because I think especially now when there's so much more information in both countries about, the downturn in the relationship and harsher stances on both sides, do you get a sense that that's kind of shaping the way the stories are told as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when I turn in, most of my editing is done. Most of my work is edited by people out here in Asia who have had a ton of experience reporting in China. My direct editor speaks Chinese and reported in China for many years. So I think that we go into conversations about stories with good faith, because I know that she knows the story well. She knows that I know the story well, and we can sort of work from there. And it does, I think, become much sharper and more nuanced. And I'm really grateful for that kind of editing, because I know that that isn't necessarily the case with everyone. I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday who said that it feels like he has to dumb it down for his editors back in his home office. So yeah, and when I think about the readers, of course, I've been told that sometimes I write to, maybe it's too inside baseball. Like maybe I'm writing for national committee type people, and I should be thinking more about readers in the U.S. But it's difficult. We're trying to be an international newspaper. We are an international newspaper, and so I think that it's difficult to sort of strike that balance. But there is a way to kind of tell a story from a sort of broad kind of perspective that can bring in readers who are maybe not necessarily totally familiar with the topic of China, but that still is interesting. And I think that it's just a matter of kind of writing kind of more, it really depends. It comes down to the writing. You just have to write in a very sort of tight, but also, use good word choice and stuff. And so I'm grateful, very grateful to my editors. They make me sound a lot better than probably I am on my own.
And how about you, Olivia?
I definitely think about my readers when I write story, but that doesn't necessarily mean like I would, tweak for something in the story I wrote. I think I always think about like, okay, I always think about, I think it's my editor talk about as well, like people's right to be informed. So I was just think they have, even though something bad happens in the US, they have the right to know. And I just write in the way that concise and really, let them know what's really happening. That's just really my first and the biggest efforts when I write a story. And, from like George of the newsworthy and importance. I think my editors at Caixin, they don't really care. The clicks is not their first, consideration when it comes to a story, right? So it's just they are just like the best editors I could have ever asked for, and I constantly, even I've been with Caixin for 4.5 years, and constantly be not surprised, but like always admire their judgment in, different stories that have been so experienced in covering all those kind of stories. So it's just it's like we of course think about like the viewers, readers, but not in the way, to tweak your story, but just what matters to them. Even I'm here, like there's so much stories, so many stories, but I can't report. I'm just by myself. I can't report everything. So you have to pick like what stories matter to your readers most, and then report. So I think it's probably more of like, the stories, the angles, the perspectives that you are choosing when it comes to readers.
Mm-hmm. Related to that, there's a question here from Kevin O'Brien, who's one of Amy's Berkeley teachers, who's tuned to watch.
Hi, Professor.
So he was asking about fake news and how that's been kind of commonly tossed around in the US, and how that's affected being a US foreign correspondent writing in China. And I would add on to that a kind of further question for both of you is just how do you vet your sources, and how do you make sure that what you're reporting is really backed up, especially when it's hard to get people, I think, on both administrations, China and the US, to comment on the record and to be really forthright about what's going on. So what tactics do you guys have?
When I was talking earlier about how I had really amazing faculty at UC Berkeley, Professor O'Brien was literally at the top of my list. So yeah, thank you for the question. I'm a little bit embarrassed now. So yeah, I mean, I think that fake news is such a huge issue. There was this great New Yorker article about College Daily, the WeChat account, in that sort of has no qualms about basically making up news in order to get clicks. And I think that, my mom is totally in this WeChat ecosystem, and I kind of see the result of that all the time when she tells me that, like, Tom Cruise is moving to our, suburban town. I'm like, no, he's not. And this just gets reflected back all the time when I'm speaking to people in China. They sort of, you find that you spend a lot of your time in interviews more and more now kind of batting down reports about, what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening in Hong Kong. And as much as you try to kind of push back, they don't always believe you. And so I think it's a really big issue. I don't really, to be honest, know how to deal with it. But yeah, it's really bad. What's the second part of the question again?
Just kind of your own process for making sure what you're reporting is vetted.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think that, we're very rigorous with fact checking, and especially when we're reporting something that's source-based, that we have to make sure that we go out and try to get it confirmed with other sources as much as possible. We've definitely seen that, of course, and in a lot of DC reporting, that it's very, when you're working with anonymous sources, that people have different kinds of motivations. And so you want to just sort of try to triangulate as much as possible to make sure that what you're reporting is actually factually accurate. I think in China, you rely a lot on kind of background conversations with people. Especially in the last few years, we have found that it's become more difficult. Like, people who were willing to speak on the record before will only speak on background, and people who are willing to speak before on background don't talk at all. And it's become very difficult actually to even just interview Chinese professors and experts on different subject matters just to get commentary. A lot of them now refer you to a black hole of a sort of PR in their institution, and you never hear back from them. And so, I wish we could include more of these voices in our report, but you have to we think we rely a lot more on just sort of having these conversations, oftentimes in person when we were there, but now kind of over the phone, where you can get them to sort of help inform your broader understanding of a thing, and then kind of, I guess, go to like outside voices to just sort of have that in your story.
Great. And Olivia, how about you?
Yeah, I think I actually, I talked about like how the difficulty to speak. I don't think I would ever get off the record conversation with officials. So for that part, I would just rely on public information, what they have said in a public event or press conferences. And what I had also trying to do is talk to people that who have connections with the government, and trying to hear from their perspective of what is actually going on, or former Trump administration officials who probably are now working at a lobby firm or something. Those are people who are willing to talk to me, to get like a full sense of what's actually they are thinking about. And that, I think I don't think I actually ever read a story just based on sources. So that probably easier for me to know about it. Probably just maybe I have heard of this might be happening, but I'll just wait until like it is official, and then I'll publish. But so that's easier part for me to distinguish, like to make sure that what I publish is already the news.
And a question from an anonymous attendee for Amy, but I'm going to ask to both of you guys is, what has been some of your most memorable or unique reporting experiences in China or the US? I think you both have described all the rigor and detail you do when you do maybe more traditional stories, but has there anything that's led you off into weird areas or different stories that might be a little bit more unique?
Yeah, I mean, last year, for example, we did a story, China has a huge gender imbalance because of the one-child policy and the preference for sons. And so we were looking into this story. My colleague in Pakistan had found a Pakistani woman who had been basically sold as a bride to a Chinese man in a small village in Shandong. And so he had her side of the story and had his ID information, and they were like, can you go try to find this guy? So, I end up in this tiny village in like random Shandong and just, looking for this guy who, like, as I'm talking to these people in the village, they're very skeptical of me and my colleague. They had sort of, didn't really want to introduce us to this person. That they didn't really know we were there. We were just sort of looking for them at first. And then I think they thought that we were potentially brides for this man. And so they eventually actually did tell him that we were there. And so he came by to kind of check us out first to see what we looked like. And I was like, oh my God, but this is okay, because this is like, how we're going to interview him. So when we eventually did, he picked us up in his little like 3-wheel flatbed truck. And then so we rode over to his home, and Shandong people, this is the home of Confucius. They're very polite. And so even if they don't want to talk to you, they feel like they have to talk to you. So we kind of took advantage of this sort of Confucius, politeness to ask him more about what had happened with his Pakistani bride. And we learned a lot more through that. It didn't end well. Obviously, she ended up back in Pakistan. But I think, the moment where I realized that I was possibly being considered as a suitor for this divorcee in this random village in Shandong, I was like, oh, my job is pretty cool. But
there's always an exit strategy. Now you know it doesn't work out. How about you, Olivia? Have you been sold as a bride to any of your contacts in the US, or is that still on the list?
Well, yeah. Actually, when you asked about that, actually, the first story that came to my mind is the story actually I did when I was in China. I was my first year at Caixin was actually working for the video department. I was working as a video journalist, and I went to those two, like, one area is like I wanted to like the telecom fraud, the 电信诈骗, like it's like there are several cases on that, and like they're really targeted those kind of text messages to a high school girl, like, who just took the college entrance exam, and it was saying like, oh, you have got this scholarship, but you should first have that kind of give them like some money to be able to get the scholarship. And she believed it, and she sent all the money to that. Of course, it's a fraud, and she just ended up like maybe had a heart attack or something, and it was dead. So that was like a very big deal. Draws a lot of attention in China. And then I went to the rural area of Fujian, which was called the Fraud Village, where like it's kind of like probably like what Amy experienced in China as well. Like when you're trying to do some story in the local area of China, the local officials are trying to stop you. I remember like I was with my cameraman colleague, and they were trying to make us stay in the office and have tea. Fujian is famous for tea, so keep asking us to have tea and to try to keep us in the office instead of like going outside to interview people. But we just it's just kind of like that battle. So I think they were closely monitoring us, and I did like a live for 30 minutes on Caixin's website. I think they were closely monitoring us, and even before I went on live, they saw pre-established a link. I don't know how they find it, but they find it and ask me, "Oh, are you gonna do a live?" And just just all those kind of navigation with local officials, and that was really interesting. And I also think like this is definitely not somewhere I would be if I'm not a journalist. So this kind of experience that makes this job interesting, I guess.
And relatedly, what stories are you eager to report on? Something you haven't reported on yet that is like always interested you, or you think that might be like your white whale or something that's kind of on your list for future reporting?
Well, it might be difficult now because I'm not in China, and I guess I'm just going to give the story, but everyone knows. I know it's no secret that I'm a huge fan of Lao Gama, and I have always wanted, she's the woman on the chili oil that, you know, many of us are familiar with. She's made my life much better, especially over the last few months. And I've always wanted to do a profile of her, but she is extremely elusive, and I have tried every possible way, basically over the last 3 years, to try to get in touch with her, and she just won't take my interview. So if anyone of you know her, tell her that I'm looking. I would love to chat with her. She's just such an iconic woman, I think, in China and in the diaspora. So, yeah.
Okay, so listeners line, if anyone has their contact info, you know where to send it. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, Lao Gama is like my ingredient whenever I do like self-cooked fried noodles. That's definitely like, it's probably like ingredient for everything, like whenever I live abroad. So definitely, I would definitely read that story if you wrote about it. So I think, yeah, I think the thing just that came to my mind is just that, you know, I have been in the US for 2.5 years, and I have been thinking, oh, I finally had the chance to cover the general election, but then everything is moving virtual, and I just got an email from DNC that they are not going to allow me in person. Of course, they are limiting the press, you know, journalists in the convention. So that's, yeah, I mean, you can still cover it, you know, they will provide you footage and everything. It's just another like a full experience of covering the convention and talking to you know, supporters or campaign managers. So it's that probably, yeah, I wouldn't be able to have that full experience this year, which is, yeah, like a shame.
Looking forward, I guess more hopefully optimistically at maybe how some of these ways in the US-China relationship, the journalism can maybe be kind of moved back out of the political sphere. We have a question here from Steve Orlins, who's the president of the committee, asking if there's any chance that the US and China will agree to allow other journalists back into each other's countries, a reciprocal return to the status quo. And I guess for both of you, do you see, how would that work? Do you think that's gonna be on the table anytime soon? And if so, kind of what would we look for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what is happening in these discussions at all, but I could definitely see a scenario in which if, you know, Biden was elected, that a sort of very easy kind of show of goodwill between the two would be to just grant a few visas. I mean, the mechanisms are already in place, and it wouldn't require a lot of work on either side, and I don't think that a lot would be lost. But I don't think that on the other hand, you know, I think it would be naive to say that even though we were ostensibly sort of being expelled for this because of this tit for tat thing, you know, it's no secret that I think China has been very annoyed with the presence of foreign correspondents within the country for a long time, and has maybe been looking for a reason to get rid of some of us. And so I don't necessarily expect a kind of full restoration of visas, but I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, eventually they do let a few back in.
Anything to add, Olivia?
Yeah, I think I kind of think like, because, you know, there are some like policies from the US government side that just targeting Chinese nationals. I'm actually not quite sure about, you know, people say like it's easier to impose those restrictions, but it's not so easy to, you know, reverse it. So I just thinking like maybe with those kind of anti-China sentiment, maybe that wouldn't be, you know, even Biden is elected, that wouldn't be his, you know, priority to reverse that. So it could happen, but probably not like very soon. That's my guess.
what would a kind of a return to normal ideally look like for you guys? Would it be a return to status quo? I guess how things were 6 months ago, or what could be done in both countries to make the environment richer for, or more productive, I guess, for foreign correspondents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back, letting more of us back on the ground, I think would be a really great start. And, you know, it's interesting to hear the stories of foreign correspondents who were in China even 20, 30 years ago, because they did have to get permission even just to leave the city. And that's not the case now, which is great. So I think going back to, I almost get the sense that it's China's conservatism almost in a way. It acts as if it has something to hide, but I actually think that there are a lot of things that if they just sort of let people go in and kind of ask questions, we would find that it's not as nefarious as it maybe seems from the outside. And so I do think that it is certainly, to at least in my context, China's benefit to allow foreign correspondents to go in. And, you know, a lot of the people, my colleagues who were at the New York Times, but also the Journal and Post, who were kicked out, are people who have spent many years dedicated to studying China, learning about the language, learning the culture, and frankly, like, love China and really love being there and love talking to the people and meeting the people. So I do think that it's a huge loss for us not to be there anymore, not just for us personally, of course, but also for just kind of China in terms of the kind of stories that are told to an outside audience.
Yeah, I think for me, I just hope that I could get more access to, you know, the U.S. government officials. But I mean, I can't complain, because I also heard complaint from U.S. reporters on that front too. So, but I mean, whenever there is probably a briefing limited to certain group of reporters, that's definitely, I wasn't included. And most of the time, you know, when Chinese officials visiting, I wasn't included either. So I just kind of felt like I'm stuck in the middle without access to both sides. So that's one thing. And another thing in terms of visa, actually the I-visa is like different policies to people of different nationalities. So say for a British national, the I-visa is 5 years multi-entry. But before this visa restriction, the I-visa for Chinese national is already like single entry, but you can stay duration of status, like means like as long as you're employed by the same employer, you can stay indefinitely. But once you leave the country, you have to reapply again. So in terms of visa, I think the ideal is definitely, 5-year multi-entry. It's just to make it so easy for us to travel outside of US, say Canada, when the Huawei's case was going on in Canada, you can go there and reporting and come back to the US without having to apply for a visa again. So that is something like the ideal situation, I would say.
And I guess a question on that, Olivia, is kind of following up on there's a few questions that I'm going to kind of combine here about Caixin, and somebody asked a question about how they wish that there was, this is from Jacqueline Chang, talking about how she wishes that there was a diversity of just kind of differentiation, I guess, between the media in China, and have a sense of what the kind of issues of varying biases are for different, like left, right, and center for Chinese news organizations. And I know Caixin, a couple other questions were talking about the readership in the US, which I know is not quite as high as it is in China, I'm sure. I wonder what that looks like for one. And then also for both of you, that your key readership is not in country. Amy, for New York Times, obviously because it's locked in China, but you do have the Chinese language reporting, and kind of talking maybe those dynamics of how that changes the way that you tell stories. And for Olivia as well, you do English and Chinese language reporting, and I assume it would be a higher readership within China. So kind of how do you balance those considerations of who's reading your work and where they're based, and if that maybe holds you to different standards in terms of when you report in English for American audiences, and Amy, when you write in Chinese for presumably Chinese readers, kind of what that, kind of how you consider those topics. And then also, I'm sorry, also getting back to Jacqueline's question, because I don't want to forget that, also then a little bit for you, Olivia, about the different, just like the landscape for media within China.
Yeah, I think for Caixin, yeah, we have both English and Chinese, but I mainly report in Chinese, but when it's the story kind of related to US-China or something like my colleagues in the English team would be interested in, think like, a foreign audience would be interested in, so they would rewrite or, translate that stories. And I personally also write story of two versions sometimes. I remember I wrote the story on, it's kind of a couple of months ago before all those TikTok, WeChat banning conversation was going. And I wrote a story about like how Chinese tech companies are lobbying in DC, just, based on the public data, like how much money they spend. It's all like public information. And I also explain a lot about, the background information about like what's lobby is like, and it's like it's legal here, and what's the basis for that, and blah blah blah. But I also wrote an English version of that, which of course I didn't introduce what lobby is, but I would include more stuff on the future trend or something. It's just like, yeah, it's like I did like have different considerations when I write stories on different languages. And in terms of readership, I actually don't know. I think actually the Chinese service is definitely, I don't have the numbers, but I think it's the English side. I heard like whenever I met someone like, China Watch or something, I think they are like a subscriber, and some may even complain about like it is expensive to, subscription. I did give the feedback back to the director of English service, but I actually think they're doing well in English too. I just don't have the numbers. And about the media landscape, I just think like, like Amy was talking about, there are so many Chinese media that are doing really great job at the beginning of this pandemic, reporting like independent ones, not just Caixin, like Yicai or Sanlian. I think it's, if you wanted to look for, read more Chinese media, then those are like those options for, people who can read Chinese and wanted to know a Chinese media's perspective.
And how about you, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, about the readers not being, our readers not really being in China. I mean, it's difficult. We do get stats for our stories and we can see, but I think because a lot of, if readers come in, they often come in because of VPNs. And so it doesn't sort of show, readers that come in on VPNs from China. So we don't actually really know. But regardless, I think that I definitely, I don't think it changes, honestly, my writing too much, because first of all, we have a great Chinese website. Most of our content, especially about China, is translated into Chinese. And even if people can't access that site because it's blocked in China, there are always ways to go. Like people, send around PDFs, they send around screenshots. So I have noticed that I always try to post screenshots of some of my stories on WeChat. So it's become more and more difficult. The WeChat censors have become very, very good. I mean, I now have my last one. I tried to did an obituary of a photographer from the Cultural Revolution, and I tried to screenshot it, and I turned it around, and then I like drew on it, and I I posted it on the WeChat, and the censors still got it. So sometimes I sort of give up, but I assume certainly if I'm interviewing someone that I would try to send them the story afterwards and do a kind of they've sort of made the time for me to talk to me. And so I, of course, want to send it back to them. But yeah, I mean, I think, when I do also think a lot about my readers in the US. And one time I got a piece of advice from an editor that was like, instead of writing like super inside baseball stories, you should think about subjects that people already know about China. Like, he said chopsticks and pandas, but I obviously there's like more than that, but then just try to like twist it a little bit and to sort of offer a new angle on that. And so more recently, for example, I'm personally a dog owner and dog lover, but I had been sent a few years ago to report on the Yulin Dog Meat Festival, which is of perennial interest in the US. And very frustratingly, because people are always, making this assumption about Chinese people eating dog meat. And so because I have sort of gotten so many questions about that over the years, I wanted to revisit the topic this year. And I think it's a really actually interesting lens into how I'm always trying to sort of break down this kind of monolith of like China, like the party. Even within the party, there's different levels of the party. Within the government, there's the local governments, and then there's central government. And I thought that there's people who are in tension with the party. And I thought this dog meat article actually really brought to light like how it was something that it was a policy that Beijing was trying to push through to ban dog meat or to discourage people from eating it. But then you had pushback from kind of local governments and also local people in these certain areas that were like, well, Beijing, you're super far away. So like, we don't really care what you think. And so, I thought that story kind of helped show these sorts of tensions that to an American reader who maybe is just drawn into the story because they love reading about Chinese people eating dog meat, but then actually realize that one, like, not only is that not true, but two, it's like there's a lot of different opinions on this subject. And I feel like hopefully they would walk away from reading a story like that with a better understanding of how the system in China is not just this one top-down kind of unified system, but actually has a lot of tensions within the system, and also tensions between people and also the system too. So those are just sorts of some of the considerations that I have when I'm thinking about my readers and how I'm writing.
Yeah, that's I think super helpful. I think so many of people who live in China kind of see every day the micro ways in which the kind of the frictions between the different structures rub against each other, whether or not you like see a sign for one thing and people are doing the exact opposite somewhere else. And then again, that's also true here where, there's things happening at various levels all the time. That's not always captured in kind of a headline story. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask a final question to the both of you before we close down. And I do want to just say a note to the audience for those who have really a huge number who've submitted questions. I'm really sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. We need a lot more hours to cover all of the amazing and interesting questions, as well as the content that's happening in US and China right now. But one last question is from an anonymous attendee, but to avoid the hostility at a people-to-people level, is there anything that readers and the general public can do to educate themselves about the other side in the current US-China relations climate? So I guess for both of you, and Amy, that kind of brought to mind the story the connection between the dog meat story is, and trying to add texture there. How do you think readers can kind of go beyond the stereotypes or the kind of maybe the first glance reading of the other country and really dig into what, the other country really has to offer?
Yeah, I think that especially compared to, when I was growing up in the Bay Area in the 90s, now it's been really incredible to see how much content there is in English about China that's written by not just sort of major news outlets, but also just kind of voices that we wouldn't have necessarily seen before. Maybe I wasn't looking for it before, so I can't say that it's new. But, we've talked about Chinese storytellers a lot in this panel, but I will just add my own personal plug for it. I think that they do an amazing job at bringing out these personal stories of like really incredible Chinese journalists and academics and whatnot. And so I would really encourage everyone to basically just look for these like these pockets that offer these kinds of personal perspectives and the kind of individual perspectives that I think are really needed because, as we're seeing Fulbright being pulled, or seeing, Peace Corps also being pulled, like these human to human kind of understandings, I think are more important than ever. There's Chinese storytellers, there's of course Caixin, there's New Voices. I wrote an article about a year or two ago about Gusha FM and the various kind of rise of Chinese podcasting. So if you can speak Chinese language, I would highly encourage you to subscribe to podcasts like that, in particular Gosha FM, is sort of like a Chinese This American Life, and you almost feel like you're in a confessional like room with these people who are telling you their individual stories that are just crazy. Yang Chen is an incredible new voice on the scene who writes about the intersection of China and America in science. She writes with such nuance and just incredible insight. I would highly recommend her. In Hong Kong recently, I've really been enjoying the work of Karen Chung. You should definitely look her up too. And there's just so many great young and people writing about their own personal experiences. I think the more that we can share these kinds of human stories, I think the better it is to kind of keep this understanding going.
Couldn't agree more. Olivia, any final thoughts on this topic before we close down?
Yeah, I felt like Amy has already mentioned all the stuff I could have mentioned. Also, I think I've been like Amy had mentioned Kaiser Guo. I have been like a really big fan of Sub China podcast. I think it's that is English language and really worth listening on different variety of China related topics. And also another for Mandarin speakers on the culture side is also this is like podcast called Loud Murmurs by one of the founding members of Chinese Storyteller. It's Mandarin based on like US pop culture and more deeper discussions. I have been huge fan of this podcast as well. So it's just all that kind of discussions. You can hear like the Chinese perspective on US culture and more society issues. So that's something I could add on.
Great. Well, we will find a way to send these recommendations or collate them when we post this video online, because I think this is very important content that we definitely want to make sure people get their hands on, because there's really, really good work coming out from all these places and also from the two of you. So again, for the National Committee and the Young China Professionals Program, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It was a really fascinating conversation. Definitely left me with a lot to think about, and I hope for the attendees who joined as well. So with that, I'll let Amy get back to her unpacking in Taiwan and Olivia get back, close down for the night on your side. I can see it's getting dark around you.
Yeah, so. I know. It's like it's getting dark, it's close to the night.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. We really appreciate it, and hope you have a nice rest of your day and evening.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.